So, alright, welcome back. And now what we're going to focus on is actually the cylinder itself. And what we've done here is we've pulled out one piston so that we can kind of go over what we're going to do. Now, obviously, by pulling out the piston, what we did was we also have the bearings, which I believe are... Matthew, where are the bearings?
Down here.
Down here. Okay, so as you can see, part of pulling out this is, you have your bearings in place. Now, if you can see there, those bearings are actually pretty beat up. They got some real nasty wear on them, so these bearings are pretty shot, and we're going to be replacing these as well. It's important that you keep your caps for your rods separate, and you don't get them mixed up, so that's why we're going to work on one piston at a time, so we don't get them mixed up, or the bolts either. The next step and most important thing here is understanding the tools needed in order to work on the cylinder. When you hone, you're going to need the proper honing tool here. So you're going to use essentially a drill and this sort of flex hone bit here. With this flex hone, you're going to attach it to your drill. Alright, you're going to take some lubricant. You're going to run some lubricant in here, typically like WD-40, and you're going to drop your hone in and out, and you're basically going to run it up and down in a motion like this, where what you're doing is you're knocking off all the built-up oil and everything that's on the cylinder walls. One of the important things to really understand about the QR is its hourglass design. What ends up happening is because we have a long stroking motor, and I'll show you for example here. Okay, we have a motor that has a pretty decent stroke here, and pardon my drawing, I know it's not that great. But for example, if we were to look at the top of the cylinder bore, so measuring right here, what we would end up with in a motor like this that has a lot of mileage, we would end up with, let's just say, a measurement of 3.5051. And then if we were to measure it here, which we will, we would end up with a measurement of, let's say, 3.5040. And then again down here we would end up with some other funky measurement where it'd be like 3.5053. Okay, now the reason why we end up with this, and kind of in a way it's kind of over dramatic here, but what you end up with is this design. Alright, and this is the hourglass that everybody talks about. The reason is because of what's called a thrust area. Alright, this thrust area is the distance when the piston is actually turning around inside the motor that pushes up against the cylinder wall. And that ends up pushing the cylinder wall out. And as the piston travels upward, alright, you end up with it straightening out and then widening it again. So you typically have like a thrust area right here and a thrust area right here, and this is what widens it out. This is where honing becomes really important, because you want to hone it straight as possible. You want to get this cylinder as straight as possible so that you have an equal measurement all the way up and down the piston, or excuse me, the cylinder walls. Another important tool that you're going to need in order to be able to measure this is actually a cylinder bore. A cylinder bore gauge, and this is a cylinder bore gauge that I have right here. It wasn't too expensive. It was only about $85 that I picked up. I don't remember where, but it's not too bad. And essentially, with a cylinder bore gauge, you're going to zero it out. All right, and here's kind of how one looks. Okay, we'll get this apart real quick here. Let's just get this out. That in there, okay, and actually what we're going to do is we're going to bring it around so it's only sprung by one, okay, so right about there. And then we're going to attach our attachment for measurement here. So with this particular motor, we're going to be looking at 3.5 or so inches, so I'm going to use the 3.6 measurement tool. Alright, now this is just roughly, and I'll go into later detail exactly how this works, but essentially you are going to zero this tool out. Okay, so if the board calls for 3.5051, let's say for example, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take our die caliper right here, and we're going to set it to 3.5051. We're going to set this to 3.5051. Then we're going to take this and we're going to set it in here, and we're going to set this to measure at 3.5051. What that ends up with is it allows me to put it in the cylinder and rock it back and forth and actually get a measurement based on whether it's beyond 3.5051 or if it's smaller than 3.5051. So what I end up seeing is I have a true zero on the gauge, and I can go in either direction, and that'll tell me if the cylinder is oversized or if it's undersized. And this is very critical when it comes to boring out and honing up a cylinder. Okay, so a little bit ago I was just discussing on the proper technique and tools that's needed in order to measure the cylinder. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't actually think about is measuring the piston itself. Realistically here, it's actually just as important, because when you measure a piston, one of the indicating factors is it's going to tell you, after you measure the diameter of the piston and you measure the diameter of the cylinder bore, it's going to tell you how much piston to cylinder wall clearance you have. And what will end up happening is if you have too much, you actually get what's called piston slap. So the technique used to measure piston here, now I may be doing this a little bit rudimentary here, but what I have is a micrometer that measures all the way down to 10,000th. And this is actually really important that you do this because you need these measurements. Now, according to the factory service manual, I believe what we have here is what's called a grade 3 piston, and the way I tell that is it actually has number 3, it's imprinted. It's a little worn down right there, but that's where it's at, and it'll say that on top of the piston when you're looking at it. Now, what we're going to be measuring here is we're actually going to be measuring the diameter of the piston. Now, we're not going to measure it at the top because the top is actually smaller. We're going to measure it at the bottom. And this is where what I was getting to before, is where thrust area is at. If you see here, there's actually some wear on the piston itself, and over here on the same side. Now, this comes from the piston actually pushing up against those cylinder walls like we were talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piston and I'm going to sit it down right here. Okay, and I'm going to look at my measurements. Now, for a grade 3 piston, the factory service manual says what is acceptable is a 3.5039 to a 3.5043. The point where I want to measure the piston is directly dead center and right here at the bottom of the piston, as far down on the skirt that I can get. Now, it's really important that we do that because that's going to tell me whether or not if that piston has collapsed from use and from running inside the motor. If the piston's collapsed, we need to replace it. If the piston's not collapsed, then we don't have to replace it. So what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to do this several times just to make sure that I get as close as accurate as possible, I'm going to try to set this in the center, and then I'm going to start turning my micrometer. Let me back this up a little bit here. I'm going to start turning my micrometer here to get the best reading that I can. Now, it looks like, based on this reading, now this is a 3.5 inch micrometer, so it looks like it's telling me that I'm set to 3.5029 or give or take right there is what it kind of shows me. So I'm going to back it out again. I'm going to write that down real quick so I don't forget that. So I'm going to 3.5029 was the first measurement. I'm going to do this a few times just to make sure that I'm accurate and I don't miss something, because I might find that it'll be wider in one measurement than another. So I'm just going to keep doing it over and over and over again until I'm pretty sure that I've hit essentially all the angles or all the little grooves maybe I might have missed beforehand. So we'll try this again, and that's where it kind of, and there we go, right there, and that's showing me, and just like I was suspecting, you know, another measurement, 3.504, and if I look over here, it looks like 41. Now that 3.5041 is within the factory specs. Alright, but I'm going to keep doing this over and over and over again until I see either a consistent average, and it'll tell me whether or not if the piston is dead on or if the piston needs to be replaced. So I'll touch base with you in a few after I've measured this a few times, probably about a dozen times, just to make sure I've got it right, and then after that we'll continue forward.